A quiet afternoon walk in a picturesque suburban neighborhood was meant to be a moment of peace, a rare slice of normalcy. A father and his young daughter strolled hand in hand, the crisp autumn air carrying faint laughter as they shared stories. It was their ritual, a cherished escape from the demands of daily life. But peace, it seemed, was not meant for people like them, not in a place like this. As they turned the corner, a police cruiser rolled up slowly beside them. The officer inside lowered his window, his gaze sharp and uninviting. "Hey," he barked, his voice laced with suspicion. "What are you two doing here?" The father raised an eyebrow, calm but firm. "We're taking a walk." "Is that a problem?" The officer stepped out of the car, his boots crunching against the gravel. His hand hovered near his belt, not the gun, but his baton. The air shifted, heavy with unspoken tension. "You don't look like you belong in this neighborhood," the officer sneered, his eyes narrowing as he glanced at the father, then at the little girl. "Where are you coming from?" The father straightened, his voice steady but low. "We live here." The officer's laugh was cold, dismissive. "I don't think so. This is private property, and I don't need people like you causing trouble." The little girl, clutching her father's hand tightly, looked up at the officer, her eyes wide and confused. "We're not causing trouble," she said softly. It was a child's innocent remark, truth spoken without malice. But it ignited something ugly in the officer. He stepped forward, towering over them, and pointed his baton at the girl. "Don't talk back to me," he roared. The father's hand shot up protectively, shielding his daughter. "That's enough. She's just a child." But the officer wasn't listening. "You think you can mouth off to me because you're walking with your head held high? You don't get to act like you're better than me." In a sudden, shocking move, the officer shoved the father backward, causing him to stumble. The little girl screamed as the officer grabbed her arm roughly, yanking her closer. "Let her go," the father shouted, his voice a mix of panic and fury. "She's just a kid." The officer's grip tightened. "Maybe you need to teach her some respect," he said coldly before shoving the girl aside. She fell hard onto the pavement, her knees scraped and bleeding, tears streaming down her face. The father lunged forward to help her, his heart pounding with rage and helplessness. But the officer blocked his path, his baton now drawn and raised. "Don't you dare," the officer warned, his voice venomous. "Or I'll arrest you both for trespassing." The father locked eyes with the officer, his jaw clenched. Every fiber of his being screamed to fight back, but he knew the consequences. The world had seen it before, a black man defending himself against a badge and baton, only to become a headline. "Why are you doing this?" the father asked, his voice trembling with controlled anger. "Because we don't look like you. Because we dared to exist in your neighborhood." The officer smirked, his expression full of disdain. "Because people like you need to learn your place." Those words cut deeper than any weapon. They were a reminder of the systemic hate embedded in every corner of their lives. But what the officer didn't know, what he couldn't have known, was who he was dealing with. Behind the father's measured restraint lay years of experience, years of fighting for justice on a scale the officer couldn't comprehend. He wasn't just a man taking a walk with his daughter. He was an FBI agent, one who had spent his career dismantling corrupt systems just like the one this officer thrived in. As the officer stood there, chest puffed out, confident in his impunity, the father's mind was already working. This wasn't over. Not by a long shot. The little girl's sobs filled the silence as the officer returned to his cruiser, leaving them bruised, physically and emotionally, but not broken. Justice was coming for him. And it would be swift, calculated, and unforgettable. What happens when someone abuses their power against the wrong man? When arrogance blinds them to the true storm they've unleashed? Stay tuned, because this is a story of justice served in the most unexpected way. At Plow of Twist, we stand firmly against any form of racism or discrimination. This story is a reflection of the struggles many face and a reminder that justice and perseverance prevail. To all our viewers, especially those who have experienced injustice due to the color of their skin, know that your voice matters and you are not alone. We hope you enjoy this powerful story of resilience and retribution. If you haven't already, make sure to hit that subscribe button, give this video a thumbs up, and share it with someone who needs to hear this message. Let's dive in. The neighborhood of Winding Oaks was picture perfect on the surface. Manicured lawns, gleaming SUVs in driveways, and rows of colonial-style homes gave the impression of an ideal suburban escape. But beneath the surface, it was a place where unspoken rules dictated who belonged and who didn't, a fragile piece that often crumbled when faces unfamiliar or unwelcome appeared. This was the world where Eric Daniels found himself raising his 8-year-old daughter, Maya. Eric had moved to Winding Oaks just a year ago, drawn by its reputation for good schools and safe streets. As a single father, his top priority was giving Maya the best chance at a bright future. Life had thrown them enough challenges already. Eric's wife, Felicia, had passed away 3 years earlier after a long battle with cancer, leaving him to navigate parenthood alone. Felicia's death had been a devastating blow, but Eric was determined to honor her memory by being the father Maya deserved. Despite his demanding job as a senior agent in the FBI, Eric made time for Maya. Their walks around the neighborhood were sacred, moments to connect, laugh, and escape the heaviness of the world. Maya, with her wild curls and an insatiable curiosity about everything, was Eric's anchor. Her questions ranged from the mundane, "Why are the clouds so puffy today, Daddy?" to the profound, "Do you think Mommy misses us in heaven?" Each answer required care, honesty, and sometimes a smile to hide the pain. Their new life in Winding Oaks wasn't without challenges. They were one of the only black families in the area, a fact that was impossible to ignore. Neighbors were polite but distant, their greetings often laced with subtle wariness. Eric felt it every time he walked Maya to the school bus or attended a community event, the lingering stares, the quick glances exchanged between couples. "Daddy, why do people look at us like that?" Maya asked once after a neighborhood block party. Eric had hesitated, weighing how much truth an 8-year-old could handle. "Sometimes people don't know how to act around others who look different from them," he explained gently. "But that's not our problem to fix, okay? Just keep being you." Maya nodded, accepting his answer for now. But Eric knew the questions would grow more complex as she got older. For now, he focused on shielding her from the harshness of the world, even as it pressed in from every side. The Daniels family wasn't invisible, though. Eric's calm, commanding presence and Maya's bubbly personality made an impression on some of their neighbors. Mrs. Callahan, an elderly widow next door, adored Maya and often invited her over for cookies and lemonade. Eric would join them occasionally, sharing polite conversation over the clink of teacups. Yet, even Mrs. Callahan, kind as she was, carried a faint hesitance in her eyes, a barrier that reminded Eric their place in this community was conditional. Eric's career added another layer of complexity to his life. As an FBI agent, he was no stranger to navigating tense situations. His work often required him to confront injustice head-on, dismantling criminal networks and exposing corruption. He had seen the best and worst of humanity and prided himself on remaining composed under pressure. But Winding Oaks tested his patience in ways even the most high-stakes investigations couldn't. It wasn't blatant hostility he faced here, it was the quiet, insidious kind, the whispered comments, the polite rejections, the assumption that he didn't belong. Still, Eric remained steadfast. He had survived worse, and for Maya's sake, he refused to let Winding Oaks break his spirit. Their home was a modest but cozy 2-story house with blue shutters and a porch swing Maya loved. Inside, the walls were adorned with family photos and Maya's colorful artwork. It was their sanctuary, a place where they could be themselves without judgment. On the fateful day that would change everything, Eric had taken the afternoon off to spend time with Maya. They had decided to walk to the park, a simple outing that should have been uneventful. The sun was warm but not overpowering, and Maya skipped along the sidewalk, humming a tune from her favorite cartoon. Eric watched her with a smile, grateful for these small moments of joy. "Daddy, look! A butterfly!" Maya exclaimed, pointing to a vibrant orange monarch fluttering nearby. "See if you can follow it," Eric encouraged, laughing as Maya darted ahead, her curls bouncing with each step. The world felt right, if only for a moment. But as they turned the corner onto Maple Lane, the mood shifted. A police cruiser idled at the curb, its engine humming softly. Eric noticed it immediately. Years of training had sharpened his instincts for potential threats. The officer inside, a stocky man in his 40s, watched them with an intensity that made Eric's stomach tighten. Maya, oblivious, kept skipping. Eric's grip on her hand tightened slightly as they approached the cruiser. He nodded politely at the officer, hoping to diffuse whatever assumptions were forming behind those mirrored sunglasses. "Excuse me," the officer called out, his tone sharp. "Where do you think you're going?" Eric stopped, turning to face the man. Maya looked up at her father, sensing his unease. "We're just out for a walk," Eric replied evenly. "Is there a problem?" The officer stepped out of the car, his presence looming. "This is a private neighborhood. You can't just wander around here." Eric's jaw tightened, but he kept his voice calm. "We live here." The officer's eyes narrowed, disbelief evident in his posture. "Oh yeah? Where?" "2 blocks over, on Pine Street," Eric replied, his patience wearing thin. Maya tugged on Eric's hand. "Daddy, can we go now?" The officer's gaze shifted to Maya, and something in his expression hardened. "You teaching your kid to talk back already?" he sneered. Eric felt his blood boil. "She's a child," he said firmly. "And we're not doing anything wrong." But the officer wasn't done. His hand moved to his baton, tapping it lightly against his palm. "People like you don't usually live around here. You sure you're not lost?" Eric stood taller, his voice steady. "We've done nothing wrong. Now, if you'll excuse us, we'll be on our way." Maya's small voice cut through the tension. "Why are you being mean to my daddy?" The officer's smirk twisted into something cruel. He stepped closer, towering over them. "You think you can talk to me like that?" he growled, his baton now firmly in hand. Eric's protective instincts kicked in, pulling Maya behind him. "That's enough," he said sharply. "We're leaving." The officer's next move was sudden, shocking. He shoved Eric backward, his strength catching him off guard. Maya screamed as her father stumbled, barely keeping his balance. And in that moment, Eric knew this wasn't just about power, it was personal. This was just the beginning. Eric sat in the quiet of his living room later that evening, the soft hum of the heater filling the silence. Maya had gone to bed hours ago, her knees bandaged, her little body curled up tightly under her blanket. The walk home had been tense, his arm wrapped protectively around her as she sniffled softly against his chest. He had reassured her over and over that they were okay, that everything would be fine. But Eric didn't feel fine. He felt like a storm was brewing in his chest, threatening to break free. His phone buzzed on the coffee table, the sharp vibration cutting through the stillness. Picking it up, he saw the name of his colleague, Paul, lighting up the screen. Paul was a fellow agent, someone Eric trusted implicitly. He hesitated for a moment before answering. "Eric, what's going on?" Paul's voice was steady but concerned. "I saw the bruises on Maya when you brought her home. Did something happen?" Eric let out a heavy sigh, running a hand over his face. "Yeah," he said finally. "Something happened." Paul listened as Eric recounted the afternoon's events, his voice low and measured, though anger simmered beneath the surface. Eric detailed the officer's aggression, the cruel words, the shove that had left his daughter scraped and shaken. By the time he finished, Paul was silent for a long moment. That's unacceptable, Paul said finally, his tone clipped. You're filing a report, right? I don't know, Eric admitted. What good would it do? It's his word against mine. You know how these things go. Paul was quiet for a beat. Maybe. But you're not just anyone, Eric. You're an agent. You know how to document things, how to push the right buttons. If you let this go, who knows who he'll target next? Eric nodded to himself, the weight of Paul's words settling over him. He wasn't just a father. He was someone who had the tools to fight back, not just for his family, but for every family who had faced the same treatment. The next day, Eric began his quiet investigation. He didn't tell Maya, wanting to shield her from any further distress. While she was at school, he combed through public records, his FBI clearance granting him access to data most people couldn't reach. He started with the officer's badge number, which he had memorized in the heat of the confrontation. The name attached to it was Officer Thomas Burke. Burke's personnel file was thin, at least on the surface. He had been with the force for over a decade and had several commendations for outstanding service. But as Eric dug deeper, he found patterns that didn't sit right. Complaints of excessive force, incidents of racial profiling, all quietly dismissed or resolved internally. It wasn't enough to build a case, but it was a start. That evening, Eric sat at the kitchen table with his laptop open, files spread out around him. The more he uncovered, the more the pieces began to fall into place. Burke's record wasn't just a list of minor infractions, it was a roadmap of unchecked power. Maya wandered into the kitchen, her stuffed bear tucked under one arm. "What are you doing, Daddy?" Eric quickly closed the laptop and smiled at her. "Just some work, sweetheart. How are you feeling?" Maya shrugged, climbing onto his lap. "Okay, I guess. But, why was that man so mean to us?" Eric wrapped his arms around her, his heart aching. "Sometimes people do bad things because they don't understand other people," he said carefully. "But we don't have to let them win, okay?" She nodded, her small fingers tracing patterns on the table. "Okay." Over the next week, Eric's investigation deepened. He reached out to a local journalist he had worked with in the past, someone who had a knack for exposing corruption. Together, they began piecing together a larger story, one that not only implicated Burke but pointed to systemic failures within the department. At the same time, Eric kept up his routine with Maya. He took her to school, helped with her homework, and kept their nightly walks limited to safer areas. But every interaction with their neighbors now felt charged. He saw the pity in Mrs. Callahan's eyes when she brought over cookies, the way Mr. Harris from across the street avoided his gaze entirely. The incident with Burke hadn't just been a personal attack, it had marked them as outsiders in a community that already saw them as different. One afternoon, Eric received a call from the journalist. "I think we've got something big," she said, her voice electric with urgency. "A former officer is willing to go on record about the cover-ups in the department. And guess whose name keeps coming up?" Eric leaned back in his chair, a grim smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. "Burke. Bingo. He's been protected for years, Eric. But this could blow the whole thing open." Eric's mind raced. The story was growing larger than he had anticipated, and with it, the stakes were rising. He knew Burke wouldn't go down without a fight. Men like him thrived on intimidation and power, and they didn't crumble easily. But Eric wasn't afraid. He had faced men like Burke before, men who thought their badges made them untouchable. That night, Eric couldn't sleep. He sat on the porch, the cool night air doing little to calm his restless thoughts. He replayed the confrontation with Burke in his mind, the way the man had smirked as if daring him to fight back. It wasn't just about what Burke had done to him and Maya, it was about what he represented. As the first light of dawn broke over Winding Oaks, Eric made a decision. This wasn't just about justice for his daughter. It was about dismantling the systems that allowed men like Burke to thrive. And he wouldn't stop until the job was done. What he didn't know was that Burke had caught wind of the brewing investigation. The officer wasn't as untouchable as he thought, and the cracks in his facade were starting to show. But Burke wasn't going down quietly, and as Eric prepared for the fight ahead, a storm was already gathering on the horizon. The tension was building, piece by piece, and both men were hurtling toward a confrontation that would change everything. The question wasn't whether justice would be served, it was how far Eric would have to go to ensure it. The hum of fluorescent lights buzzed faintly in the cramped room where Eric sat, his hands resting calmly on the steel table in front of him. The air was thick with tension, the kind that settles in a space just before something monumental happens. Across from him sat Officer Thomas Burke, his usual air of cocky self-assurance replaced by something more guarded. He had been called to this meeting under the pretense of a routine review, nothing unusual, just a check-in about community relations. But Eric had orchestrated every detail of this moment. Burke's foot tapped impatiently against the floor as he leaned back in his chair, his smirk returning. "So, Agent Daniels," he said, dragging out the title with mock respect. "What's this really about? You here to give me a lecture on neighborhood friendliness?" Eric's expression didn't waver. He had prepared for this, rehearsed it in his mind 100 times. He met Burke's gaze evenly, the calm in his eyes unsettling. "I'm here because what you did to me and my daughter isn't just about one bad afternoon. It's about a pattern. Your pattern." Burke let out a low chuckle, shaking his head. "Is that right? You mean the part where you were trespassing in a private neighborhood?" Eric leaned forward, his voice steady but sharp. "The part where you assaulted an 8-year-old girl for walking in her own neighborhood." The smile faltered, just for a second, but Burke recovered quickly. "You're grasping at straws, Daniels. I didn't touch her. And even if I did, who's gonna believe you? My record's clean." Eric's lips pressed into a thin line, his jaw tightening. "Your record's been protected. But that stops today." Burke's smirk faded completely now, replaced by a thin veneer of defensiveness. "You don't have anything on me." Eric reached into the folder in front of him and slid a sheet of paper across the table. Burke glanced at it, his brow furrowing as he scanned the list of names. Each one represented a complaint, an official record of his actions that had been buried by the department. Excessive force. Misconduct. Racial profiling. "These are just complaints," Burke said, his voice tinged with irritation. "Anyone can file one of these. And some of them have," Eric replied coolly. "People you targeted because you thought they didn't matter. But here's the thing, Officer Burke, they do matter. And they're not afraid to speak up anymore." Burke's jaw clenched as Eric slid another document toward him. This one was a sworn statement from a former officer in the department, detailing the systemic cover-ups that had protected Burke and others like him. Burke's name was highlighted multiple times, each mention a nail in the coffin. "This is a joke," Burke said, though his voice lacked its usual confidence. "You're just trying to scare me." Eric leaned back in his chair, his calm demeanor unwavering. "Am I? Because I think the DA will find this pretty compelling. And once the press gets a hold of it," he let the sentence hang, the implication clear. Burke slammed his fist on the table, the sound echoing in the small room. "You don't know who you're messing with. And you don't know who you messed with," Eric shot back, his voice rising slightly for the first time. "You thought I was just another black man you could push around. But I'm not. I'm someone who has the resources, the determination, and the evidence to make sure you're held accountable for every single person you've hurt." Burke's face reddened, his composure slipping further. "You think you're some kind of hero? You think taking me down will fix anything?" "I think it's a start," Eric replied firmly. "You've been hiding behind your badge for years, Burke. But that badge doesn't make you untouchable." For a moment, the room fell silent, the weight of Eric's words hanging in the air. Burke's bravado cracked, and for the first time, he looked uncertain. Then the door opened, and Paul stepped in, followed by the journalist Eric had been working with. She carried a recorder, her expression sharp and professional. Burke's eyes darted between them, realization dawning. "You set me up," he said, his voice low and venomous. "No," Eric corrected. "You set yourself up. I just gave you the chance to tell the truth. And you chose to lie." The journalist spoke for the first time. "Officer Burke, do you have anything to say about the allegations against you? This is your opportunity to respond." Burke's hands clenched into fists, his knuckles white. "I don't have to explain myself to you." "No, you don't," Eric said, standing up and gathering the documents into his folder. "But you will explain yourself to the court. And to every person who's been waiting for justice." Burke rose abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. "This isn't over, Daniels." "You're right," Eric said, his voice cold. "It's just beginning." As Burke stormed out of the room, the journalist turned to Eric, her eyes alight with purpose. "This is going to be big," she said. "Are you ready for the fallout?" Eric nodded. "It's not about me. It's about making sure people like him don't get to ruin lives without consequences." The journalist packed up her things, and Paul clapped a hand on Eric's shoulder. "You did good," he said. "This wasn't easy, but you did the right thing." Eric's mind drifted briefly to Maya, asleep at home, unaware of the storm her father had just weathered for her, and for so many others. He felt a deep sense of satisfaction, but also resolve. This fight wasn't just about one man. It was about changing the system that allowed men like Burke to thrive. As he walked out of the building into the crisp night air, Eric allowed himself a small smile. The road ahead would be long, but for the first time in a while, he felt hope. The wheels of justice were finally turning. As Eric exited the building, his mind churned with the events of the day. The confrontation with Burke was just the beginning, and he knew the battle ahead would be messy. Still, there was a flicker of vindication. For years, men like Burke had operated with impunity, their actions dismissed as isolated incidents, their victims silenced by fear. But not this time. Not anymore. Eric's phone buzzed in his pocket. He pulled it out to see Paul's name on the screen. He answered quickly, his voice steady despite the lingering tension in his chest. "Paul." "Eric, we might have a problem," Paul said, his tone clipped. "Burke's making noise. He's been talking to some people in the department, claiming you're targeting him for personal reasons." Eric's jaw tightened. "Of course he is. He knows his back is against the wall." "What are they saying?" "They're circling the wagons," Paul admitted. "A few of his buddies are already trying to discredit your case. They're saying you're using your FBI position to settle a personal vendetta." Eric let out a slow breath, his grip tightening on the phone. "Let them talk. The evidence will speak for itself." Paul hesitated. "I just want you to be careful. You've got the truth on your side, but you know how this works. They'll twist it any way they can." "I know," Eric said, his voice firm. "But I'm not backing down." After the call ended, Eric stood in the parking lot for a moment, letting the cool night air settle over him. He wasn't surprised by the backlash, he had expected it. Men like Burke didn't go quietly, and their allies often fought just as hard to protect them. But Eric had been through worse, and he wasn't about to let fear dictate his next move. The next morning, Eric sat at his kitchen table with Maya, who was eating her cereal and chattering about her upcoming school project. Despite everything, Eric couldn't help but smile at her enthusiasm. Maya's resilience was a constant reminder of why he was fighting so hard. "Daddy, do you think I can use glitter on my poster?" she asked, her eyes wide with excitement. "Of course," Eric said, reaching out to ruffle her curls. "Just don't get it all over the house, okay?" Maya giggled, her laughter filling the room. For a moment, Eric allowed himself to forget about Burke, about the investigation, about the weight pressing down on his shoulders. But the reprieve was short-lived. A sharp knock at the door broke the peaceful moment. Eric's instincts flared, and he stood quickly, motioning for Maya to stay at the table. When he opened the door, he found two uniformed officers standing on his porch, their expressions unreadable. "Mr. Daniels," one of them said, his tone professional but clipped. "We need to ask you a few questions." Eric's eyes narrowed, his mind immediately racing through possibilities. "About what?" "It's regarding a complaint filed against you by Officer Burke," the other officer said. "He's alleging harassment and abuse of authority." Eric's lips pressed into a thin line. "Is that so?" "We'd like you to come down to the station to answer some questions," the first officer said, his gaze steady but lacking any warmth. Eric didn't move. "I'll answer your questions, but I'm not going anywhere without my lawyer." The officers exchanged a glance, and one of them nodded. "That's your right. We'll be in touch." As they walked away, Eric closed the door and leaned against it, his heart pounding. Maya peeked around the corner, her face scrunched with worry. "Daddy, who were those men?" "Just some people from work," Eric said, forcing a smile. "Nothing to worry about." But inside, he was anything but calm. Burke was escalating, and the stakes were rising with every move. Later that day, Eric met with the journalist again, laying out the latest developments. She listened carefully, her pen moving quickly across her notepad. "This is retaliation," she said bluntly. "He's trying to muddy the waters and paint you as the bad guy." "I know," Eric said. "But we need to stay focused. The evidence is solid, and the witnesses are ready to testify. Burke can play dirty, but he can't outrun the truth." The journalist nodded, her expression resolute. "Then let's make sure the truth is loud enough that no one can ignore it." The following days were a whirlwind of activity. The story broke in the local news, sparking outrage and support in equal measure. Maya's school was inundated with reporters trying to get a comment, forcing Eric to keep her home for a few days. Despite the chaos, Eric felt a sense of momentum building. The community was rallying, and more voices were coming forward with their own stories of abuse at the hands of Burke and his colleagues. But Burke wasn't done. Late one evening, Eric received an anonymous call. "You think you're a hero, Daniels?" The voice was low, gravelly, and unmistakably Burke's. "You're just a punk playing in the big leagues. This isn't going to end well for you." Eric's grip tightened on the phone, his voice cold. "This isn't a game, Burke. And you're about to find out what happens when you cross the wrong man." The line went dead, but Eric wasn't shaken. If anything, the call only strengthened his resolve. Burke was desperate, and desperation made people sloppy. The final straw came 2 days later when a key witness in the case reported being followed home by an unmarked car. The journalist called Eric immediately, her voice laced with urgency. "This is getting out of hand," she said. "We need to bring this to the FBI officially. It's time to go all in." Eric agreed, and within hours, a formal investigation was launched into not just Burke, but the entire department. The revelations that followed were damning: systemic corruption, cover-ups, and a culture of impunity that stretched far beyond Burke himself. As Eric prepared for the next phase of the battle, he knew the hardest part was yet to come. Burke had made it clear he wouldn't go quietly, and the system that had protected him for so long wouldn't crumble overnight. But Eric wasn't fighting alone anymore. The tide was turning, and for the first time, justice felt not just possible, but inevitable. The fallout began almost immediately. The FBI's formal investigation, combined with the journalists' relentless reporting, had sent shockwaves through Winding Oaks and far beyond. News outlets picked up the story, and suddenly, Officer Thomas Burke's name was on every screen, his face a symbol of a broken system. But the investigation had also uncovered something larger, something that even Eric hadn't fully anticipated. The Winding Oaks Police Department wasn't just protecting Burke. They were actively enabling him and others like him. Emails, internal memos, and testimony from former officers painted a damning picture of a culture that rewarded silence and punished accountability. It wasn't just about Burke's actions that day, it was about years of unchecked abuse. Eric watched the coverage unfold from his living room, Maya playing quietly on the floor with her crayons. The TV screen showed footage of protesters gathered outside the Winding Oaks Police Department, holding signs that read "Justice for All" and "End Police Corruption." Eric felt a pang of pride but also a deep sense of responsibility. This wasn't over. The system that had allowed Burke to thrive was still standing, though now it was cracking under the weight of public scrutiny. Paul called later that evening, his voice tense but optimistic. "Eric, the FBI's findings are coming out tomorrow. It's bad, really bad, for Burke and the department." "How bad?" Eric asked, though he could already imagine the answer. "Enough to warrant federal oversight," Paul replied. "Burke's looking at multiple charges: assault, falsifying reports, obstruction of justice. But it's not just him. The chief and several high-ranking officers are implicated, too." Eric leaned back against the couch, the gravity of it all sinking in. "Good," he said finally. "It's about time." But with victory came consequences. Eric had known from the beginning that taking on Burke and the department would make him a target, and now the backlash was in full force. His phone rang constantly, reporters hounding him for comments, while online trolls flooded his social media with threats and vitriol. "You're tearing apart a good man's career," one voicemail sneered. "People like you don't belong in Winding Oaks." Eric deleted the messages without hesitation, but the words stuck with him. It was a reminder that even when justice was served, there were always those who resisted change, clinging to their biases and fears. Maya noticed the tension, of course. She was too young to understand the full scope of what was happening, but she saw the worry in her father's eyes, the way he stayed up late into the night working. One evening, as Eric was going through another stack of documents, she climbed onto his lap and rested her head on his chest. "Daddy, are you okay?" she asked softly. Eric wrapped his arms around her, his voice steady despite the storm raging inside him. "I'm okay, sweetheart. Just a lot of grown-up stuff to figure out." "Are the bad guys going to get in trouble?" she asked, her voice tinged with hope. "They are," Eric said firmly. "But it takes time." Maya nodded, satisfied for now, and Eric felt a surge of determination. This fight wasn't just for him, it was for her and every child who deserved a world where they could walk freely without fear. The next day brought another twist. Burke had been arrested, his face plastered across every news outlet as he was led out of the police station in handcuffs. It was a moment of vindication for Eric, but also a sobering reminder of how much damage one man could cause. Burke's lawyer wasted no time spinning the narrative, claiming his client was being scapegoated by a corrupt system. "He's not the problem," the lawyer said during a press conference. "He's a symptom of a broken system, and punishing him alone won't fix it." Eric couldn't disagree with that. Burke wasn't the only one responsible, and as the investigation deepened, the web of corruption grew more tangled. The police chief resigned under pressure, but his departure didn't erase the years of harm done under his watch. Meanwhile, the journalist's story continued to gain traction. She had uncovered more victims willing to speak out, their voices adding weight to the case. One of them, a young man named Jamal, shared his story in a televised interview, recounting how Burke had harassed him for years simply for walking through his own neighborhood. "I thought I didn't matter," Jamal said, his voice shaking. "But seeing someone like Agent Daniels stand up, it gave me hope." Eric watched the interview with a heavy heart. He didn't see himself as a hero, just a man doing what was right. But hearing Jamal's words reminded him why this fight mattered. It wasn't just about punishing Burke, it was about dismantling the system that had allowed him to operate unchecked. Despite the progress, the tension in Winding Oaks was palpable. Protesters clashed with counter-protesters, the divide in the community growing wider. Eric became a lightning rod for both praise and criticism, his face now synonymous with the battle for justice. Maya's school sent a letter home asking if she needed additional security, a chilling reminder of the risks they faced. Eric's phone rang late one evening, and this time, it wasn't Paul or a journalist. It was the police chief himself, recently disgraced but still trying to salvage his reputation. "Daniels," the chief began, his voice strained. "We need to talk." Eric's jaw tightened. "I don't think we have anything to discuss." "You've made your point," the chief said. "Burke's done, and the department's taking the heat. But this investigation, it's tearing the community apart." "Maybe it needed to be torn apart," Eric replied coldly. "So it can be rebuilt the right way." The chief sighed. "You don't understand what you're doing. You think you're fixing things, but all you're doing is creating chaos." "I'm exposing the truth," Eric said. "If that causes chaos, so be it." The call ended abruptly, leaving Eric staring at the phone, his emotions churning. The chief's words echoed in his mind, not because they held any weight, but because they revealed the desperation of a man clinging to a crumbling system. As the days turned into weeks, the consequences of Eric's actions continued to ripple outward. Burke remained in custody, his trial looming on the horizon. The department was under federal oversight, with sweeping reforms being implemented. But the road ahead was still uncertain, and Eric knew the fight was far from over. One evening, as Eric sat on the porch with a cup of coffee, Paul joined him, their silence stretching comfortably between them. "You did good, Eric," Paul said finally. "You made them see what they didn't want to see." Eric nodded, his gaze fixed on the horizon. "It's not enough." "It's a start," Paul said. "And sometimes, that's all we can hope for." Eric's thoughts drifted to Maya, asleep upstairs, her world forever changed by what had happened. He had set out to protect her, to shield her from the ugliness of the world. But in doing so, he had shown her something even more important, that standing up for what's right, even when it's hard, is the only way to create real change. As the night deepened, Eric felt a sense of calm settle over him. The battle wasn't over, but for the first time, he felt like they were moving in the right direction. Eric's steps were heavy as he walked into the dimly lit community center, where a town hall meeting had been hastily arranged. The atmosphere was tense, with rows of folding chairs filled by residents of Winding Oaks, some familiar, many not. The room buzzed with murmurs of dissent, support, and confusion. On one side sat protesters holding signs that read "Accountability Now" and "Justice for Maya." On the other, a group of locals glared, their arms crossed, their expressions hardened with defiance. At the front of the room, a small panel had been set up, with city officials, a representative from the FBI, and a few community leaders seated. Eric was invited to join the panel, but he declined. He didn't want to be a figurehead, he wanted the focus to remain on the system that needed dismantling, not the man who had simply done his job. As he took a seat in the back, Paul sidled up next to him. "You ready for this circus?" Paul asked under his breath. Eric glanced at him, a faint smirk playing on his lips. "I've been ready since the day Burke decided to put his hands on my daughter." The meeting began with a moderator explaining the purpose of the gathering, to address the findings of the investigation, provide a platform for the community, and discuss the changes being implemented. But it didn't take long for the tension in the room to boil over. A man in his late 50s, wearing a worn flannel shirt and a baseball cap, stood abruptly, pointing an accusing finger toward the panel. "This whole thing is a witch hunt," he shouted. "You're tearing apart good officers because one of them made a mistake." Murmurs of agreement rippled through a section of the audience, while others responded with sharp retorts. A woman across the aisle stood next, her voice trembling with anger. "A mistake. My son was harassed by Burke for years. He couldn't even walk to the store without being stopped and searched like a criminal." The man turned to her, his voice rising. "Maybe if your son wasn't acting suspicious, he wouldn't have had any trouble. The room erupted into chaos, voices overlapping as accusations and defenses flew back and forth. Eric remained seated, his hands clasped tightly in his lap. He could feel the weight of every word, the emotions in the room threatening to spiral out of control. "Enough," a voice boomed, silencing the crowd. It was one of the community leaders on the panel, a middle-aged pastor with a commanding presence. "This is exactly the problem. We can't even have a conversation without tearing each other apart." The room quieted, though the tension lingered. The pastor continued, his voice steady but firm. "We're here because something is broken. Whether you want to admit it or not, this isn't about one officer or one incident. This is about years, decades, of mistrust, of pain, of injustice. Ignoring it won't make it go away." Eric felt a pang of respect for the pastor. He had a way of cutting through the noise, of forcing people to confront the truth. But the silence didn't last long. A younger man, sitting near the front, raised his hand hesitantly. "What's going to happen to Burke?" he asked, his voice quiet but filled with curiosity. "Is he going to jail?" The FBI representative cleared his throat, adjusting his glasses. "Officer Burke has been charged with multiple counts, including assault and obstruction of justice. If convicted, he will face significant jail time. Additionally, the department has been placed under federal oversight to ensure these patterns of misconduct are addressed." Another voice chimed in from the back. "And what about the other officers? Burke didn't act alone. Are they being held accountable?" The representative hesitated, his measured response not satisfying the growing anger in the room. "The investigation is ongoing, and we are committed to identifying all individuals involved." Eric could see where this was heading. The crowd wasn't just angry at Burke, they were angry at the system that had allowed him to thrive. And while progress was being made, it wasn't happening fast enough for people who had waited a lifetime for justice. A young woman with braids and a fiery expression stood next, her voice cutting through the room like a blade. "Why did it take a federal agent's daughter being hurt for anyone to care? My brother has been telling his story for years, and no one listened. Now you're all here acting like you care." The words stung, and Eric felt the weight of them. She wasn't wrong. His position had given him access and leverage that others didn't have. It was a privilege, and one he couldn't ignore. Eric rose from his seat, all eyes turning toward him as he made his way to the front of the room. He hadn't planned to speak, but the moment demanded it. He stood before the crowd, his tall frame imposing but his voice calm. "She's right," Eric began, his gaze sweeping the room. "It shouldn't have taken my daughter being hurt for this to happen. It shouldn't have taken my badge, my connections, to get people to pay attention. And for that, I'm sorry." The room was silent now, the weight of his words settling over the crowd. Eric continued, his voice steady but filled with emotion. "But now that we're here, we have a choice. We can keep fighting each other, pointing fingers, blaming individuals. Or we can fight the system that allowed this to happen in the first place." He turned toward the young woman who had spoken. "You're right to be angry. And I can't change the past. But I promise you, I'm not just here for my daughter. I'm here for your brother, and for everyone else who's been hurt by this system." Her expression softened slightly, though her eyes still burned with intensity. Eric's gaze moved back to the crowd. "This is just the beginning," he said. "The fight doesn't end with Burke going to jail. It doesn't end with federal oversight. It ends when every person in this community feels safe, when every child can walk down the street without fear. And that's going to take all of us." The room erupted in applause, though not everyone joined in. Eric could see the skeptics, the holdouts who weren't ready to trust the system, or him. But he didn't need unanimous support. He just needed enough people willing to stand together. As the meeting wound down, Eric found himself surrounded by people wanting to share their stories, their pain, their hopes. Maya's voice echoed in his mind, "Are the bad guys going to get in trouble? For the first time, Eric felt like he could answer her with confidence. Yes, they were. But it was only the beginning. The courtroom was filled with a tense, expectant silence as the judge read the final verdict. Burke sat at the defendant's table, his once cocky demeanor replaced by a sullen resignation. The evidence had been overwhelming, the testimonies damning, and the jury had taken little time to deliberate. Thomas Burke, the judge said, his voice even and firm, "This court finds you guilty on all counts, including assault, falsifying reports, and obstruction of justice." A murmur spread through the courtroom. For the victims seated in the gallery, many of whom had waited years for justice, it was a moment of release. Burke's shoulders slumped as the sentence was handed down, a lengthy prison term and the permanent loss of his badge. For a man who had used his position as a shield for his actions, the judgment struck at the core of his identity. Eric sat a few rows back, Maya beside him. He glanced down at her, seeing the subtle nod she gave when the verdict was announced. She didn't fully understand the complexities of what had just happened, but she understood enough: the man who had hurt her would face consequences. After the sentencing, Burke was escorted out in handcuffs, his eyes scanning the room one last time. When they landed on Eric, they burned with resentment. Eric didn't flinch, his gaze steady. This wasn't about vengeance, it was about accountability. As the courtroom emptied, Paul approached Eric with a faint smile. "You did it," he said. "Or at least, you started it." Eric nodded, the weight of the months-long battle finally beginning to lift. "It wasn't just me. It was everyone who spoke up, everyone who refused to stay silent." The aftermath of the trial rippled across Winding Oaks and beyond. The police department underwent sweeping changes, with several officers resigning or being removed from their positions. A federal monitor was appointed to oversee the department, ensuring reforms were implemented. For the first time in decades, the community felt a glimmer of hope that things might truly change. Eric found himself at the center of the conversation, though he didn't seek the spotlight. He continued to work with the victims who had come forward, helping them navigate the legal system and ensuring their voices were heard. The journalists' ongoing coverage highlighted these stories, giving faces and names to the statistics that had once been ignored. Maya, too, found her own way of processing what had happened. During a school assembly on kindness and inclusion, she stood up to share her story, her voice small but steady. "My dad always says we have to do what's right, even when it's hard," she told her classmates. "And sometimes, doing what's right helps other people feel safe." Eric watched from the back of the room, his chest swelling with pride. Maya's resilience was a testament to everything he had fought for, and he knew that she, like him, would carry these lessons forward. Not everyone in Winding Oaks welcomed the changes, of course. Some residents moved away, unable to reconcile their vision of the town with its new reality. Others stayed but remained wary, their prejudices too deeply ingrained to be undone by a single trial. Eric accepted this as an unfortunate but inevitable truth. Change, he knew, was a process, not a moment. One afternoon, as Eric walked through the neighborhood with Maya, they passed Mrs. Callahan's house. The elderly widow waved them over, offering her usual tray of cookies. But this time, there was something different in her demeanor, a quiet gratitude, perhaps, or a newfound understanding. "You've done something important, Eric," she said, her voice soft but firm. "It's not easy to shake up a place like this. But it needed to be done." Eric thanked her, feeling the sincerity in her words. Moments like these reminded him that even small shifts in perspective could have a lasting impact. Months later, Eric received an invitation to speak at a community event organized by the new police chief, a young, black woman brought in to lead the department's transformation. The event was a celebration of progress and a commitment to continued growth. Standing before the crowd, Eric spoke from the heart. "This isn't the end of the story," he said. "It's just the beginning. Real change doesn't happen overnight. It takes time, effort, and a willingness to confront uncomfortable truths. But every step forward matters." As the crowd applauded, Eric felt a deep sense of fulfillment. He had set out to protect his daughter, but in the process, he had helped create a safer, more just community for everyone. It wasn't a perfect victory, but it was meaningful. Later that night, as Eric tucked Maya into bed, she looked up at him with sleepy eyes. "Are the bad guys gone now?" she asked. Eric smiled, brushing a curl from her forehead. "Some of them. But we'll keep working until they all are." Maya nodded, satisfied, and drifted off to sleep. Eric sat by her bedside for a moment, the quiet of the house wrapping around him like a warm blanket. For the first time in months, he felt at peace. This story isn't just about one man's fight for justice. It's about the power of standing up, speaking out, and refusing to accept the status quo. It's about the ripple effect that one act of courage can have on an entire community. What would you do in Eric's position? Would you have the strength to take on a system, knowing the risks and sacrifices involved? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. If you found this story inspiring, don't forget to hit the like button and share it with someone who needs to hear it. And if you want more stories like this, be sure to subscribe to Tales of Twist for more powerful narratives that remind us of the strength within us all.